Buenas tardes. Durante esta serie de conferencias denominada Toda la verdad sobre el Galeón San José, hemos visto las diferentes problemáticas que afectan los intereses de los colombianos, inherentes o relacionadas con el patrimonio cultural sumergido contenido en el Galeón San José. Ahora bien, desde el punto de vista patrimonialista, los intereses nacionales sobre este naufragio se encuentran jurídicamente a salvo desde el 23 de enero de 2020, cuando se dio la acertada declaración del Galeón San José como un bien de interés cultural de la nación, hecho eminente por parte del gobierno del presidente Iván Duque. Si bien nuestro interés en el Galeón San José se ha centrado en el tema cultural y patrimonial, la declaratoria del mismo como un bien de interés cultural no basta para que abandonemos su causa, pues su situación aún dista mucho de ser la debida. Lo anterior por varias razones. Primera, a pesar de haber sido declarado el Galeón San José como un bien de interés cultural de la nación desde el pasado 23 de enero de 2020, por la cual goza este magnífico patrimonio de una protección constitucional reforzada, el mismo sigue literalmente botado a su suerte en un área marítima que es de dominio público. Por lo tanto, se encuentra en eminente peligro de ser saqueado en cualquier momento, aunque lamentablemente les tengo que decir que ya existen evidencias de que esto ha podido haber ocurrido, como lo veremos con expertos en una futura conferencia en este mismo canal. Segunda, a pesar de haber sido declarado el Galeón San José como un bien de interés cultural por parte del Ministerio de Cultura de Colombia, este mismo ministerio mantiene vigente una aberrante APP o asociación público-privada ideada durante el gobierno Santos, en la cual se tiene previsto pagar actualmente el rescate del Galeón San José con hasta el 45% de su propia carga, lo que se encuentra expresamente prohibido en la ley. Y por más que hemos solicitado al gobierno la cancelación de esta funesta asociación público-privada, el gobierno del doctor Iván Duque se resiste negligentemente a su anulación. Tercero, aunque como va dicho, el Galeón San José como un bien de interés cultural de la nación colombiana se encuentra jurídicamente a salvo, la problemática que acechaba sus bienes patrimoniales ahora terminó acechando el patrimonio público de la nación, y esto por lo siguiente. En el año 1982, una empresa norteamericana llamada Sea Search Armada, contratada por el gobierno colombiano para adelantar exploraciones en búsqueda de especies náufragas en nuestras aguas, denunció el hallazgo de un naufragio en un área que le fue autorizada para explorar. Se dijo en aquel entonces que esta empresa había encontrado el Galeón San José, aunque nunca se pudo comprobar que realmente fuera este navío. Pero de lo que sí no queda duda es que esta empresa sí encontró los restos de al menos un naufragio en esa zona. La ley para ese entonces no consideraba este tipo de bienes como lo hace hoy día, que los define como patrimonio cultural sumergido. En aquel tiempo, estos eran considerados simplemente como tesoros, y la legislación otorgaba a quien denunciara su ubicación el 50% de lo que fuese extraído, así no fuera el propio denunciante quien adelantara el rescate. Este tema con los norteamericanos de Sea Search Armada se complicó por una serie de acontecimientos y todo terminó en los tribunales, los cuales, después de décadas de litigios, terminaron confirmando que el 50% de los bienes que fueran extraídos de esa área, que tuvieran aquella calidad de tesoros, se dividirían por mitades, una para la nación y la otra para la empresa norteamericana Sea-Shepherd Armada. Aunque el Estado colombiano se ha negado a aceptar esta realidad, acudiendo a interpretaciones subjetivas sobre el alcance de la sentencia que dictó la Corte Suprema de Justicia, este es un problema que aún no se resuelve. Por tanto, la inseguridad jurídica que pesaba sobre el 50% de los bienes del Galeón San José, ahora pesa sobre el patrimonio público de los colombianos, pues como va dicho, la carga del galeón ya no puede ser usada como medio de pago. Por otra parte, en 2015 el presidente Juan Manuel Santos se ideó un plan perverso para redescubrir el Galeón San José. Y para esto trajo a unos señores extranjeros a quienes ofreció remunerarlos hasta con el 45% de los bienes que fueran extraídos del naufragio. El perverso plan contaba con un factor fundamental. Todo se manejaría bajo secreto. Y el mayor secreto de todos era que Santos entregaría a los extranjeros una parte o porción de la misma área de exploración que había sido concedida a los denunciantes del hallazgo de 1982. Es decir, parte de esa misma zona donde los señores de Sea-Shepherd Armada encontraron el naufragio de 1982, hallazgo reconocido hoy en día por un fallo de la Corte Suprema de Justicia y sobre el cual pesa un embargo que garantiza el cumplimiento de dicho fallo. El plan se le complicó a Santos y a su corte gracias a la actuación de un grupo de ciudadanos preocupados, quienes lograron meterle el palo en la rueda a esos perversos planes, y entre suspensión y suspensión se logró evitar que el contrato se firmara y se le acabó el periodo a Santos y no pudo firmar, gracias a Dios, ese tal contrato. Con la llegada del gobierno Duque, confiábamos que todas las irregularidades desarrolladas sobre este asunto se aclararían, pero para nuestra total desilusión, simplemente sacaron el Galeón San José del tema, declarándole como un bien de interés cultural, pero condescendiendo con la trama perversa y dejando como blanco alterno de Santos y su camarilla el patrimonio público de los colombianos, lo cual por supuesto estamos decididos a no permitir, y por ello estamos hoy aquí para mostrar a los colombianos y al mundo que la inseguridad jurídica que se cierne sobre el patrimonio de los colombianos a raíz del hallazgo de 1982 es una realidad que hay que enfrentar y solucionar, y que las razones que tenemos para advertir que dicha inseguridad jurídica con el redescubrimiento del Galeón San José en 2015 se eleva entonces a un infame 95%, que ahora ya no amenaza el patrimonio cultural, ahora amenaza el patrimonio público de la nación. Es indignante ver a la dirigencia de un país con tantos problemas en una trama tan evidente, donde pretenden burlar a los colombianos como si aún estuviéramos en aquellos tortuosos tiempos en que se entregaban nuestras riquezas a cambio de cualquier espejito. Ahora repasemos lo dicho viendo algunas imágenes para mayor claridad. En esta primera imagen podemos apreciar el polígono autorizado por el gobierno colombiano, en el cual Sea-Shepherd Armada denunció el hallazgo de especies náufragas en el año 1982. El punto de su denuncio se indica con un pequeño cuadro amarillo en el interior del polígono. Aquí es oportuno aclarar lo siguiente. En aquel entonces, la legislación colombiana permitía cierto margen de error sobre la posición del hallazgo. Puntualmente, el artículo 112 del Decreto Ley 2349 de 1971, que a la letra dice: La Dirección General Marítima y Portuaria dictará un reglamento para determinar la forma de registrar los avisos que se dan conforme a lo dispuesto en el artículo precedente en relación a las coordenadas geográficas que determinan la posición de cada hallazgo y las márgenes de error que se puedan aceptar. Para 1982, año del denuncio realizado por la empresa Sea Search Armada, la Dirección General Marítima y Portuaria no había dictado ningún reglamento con respecto a esas márgenes de error. Por cierto, creo que nunca se hizo. Por tanto, los denuncios se hacían diciendo en las áreas aledañas o en la vecindad inmediata. Esto también tiene sentido si se considera que para 1982 el sistema de posicionamiento global era algo muy diferente a lo que conocemos hoy y su protocolo se remontaba por allá a 1927. Por tanto, era perfectamente lógico que se consideraran dichos márgenes de error y no está por más decir que el protocolo actual del sistema de posicionamiento global GPS data del año 1984, es decir, 2 años después que la empresa Sea Search Armada realizó su denuncia sobre el hallazgo. Ahora bien, como los dichos márgenes de error no se determinaron por la autoridad competente, la vecindad inmediata al punto denunciado se tiene que circunscribir al área del polígono autorizado. Asumir que las áreas aledañas o vecindad inmediata equivale a una u otra medida sería simplemente arbitrario. Y eso lo debe saber cualquier abogado. Así trabaje en la Agencia Nacional para la Defensa Jurídica del Estado, en la Dirección General Marítima, en el Instituto Colombiano de Antropología e Historia, en el Ministerio de Cultura o en la misma Presidencia de la República. Aquí es donde los sabios asesores del Estado recurren a interpretar el fallo de la Corte Suprema de Justicia, leyendo en él lo que les interesa leer, sin importarles las consecuencias que su interpretación cause sobre el patrimonio de los colombianos. Así es que ahora los invito a que leamos juntos qué fue lo que dijo la Corte Suprema de Justicia, a ver qué es lo que entendemos nosotros. Numeral segundo de la parte resolutiva de la sentencia de casación proferida por la Sala de Casación Civil de la Corte Suprema de Justicia el 5 de julio de 2007. Segundo, la propiedad allí reconocida por partes iguales para la nación y la demandante está referida única y exclusivamente a los bienes que se encuentran en las coordenadas referidas en el reporte confidencial sobre exploración submarina efectuada por la compañía Glocamorra en el Mar Caribe, Colombia, febrero 26 de 1982, página 13, número 49195, Berlitz Translation Service, sin incluir, por lo tanto, espacios, zonas o áreas diversas. Muy bien hasta aquí. Ahora veamos qué es lo que dice la aludida página 13, número 49195, de la Berlitz Translation Service. Aquí podemos apreciar el documento donde claramente le vemos el sello de reservado. Página 13, el número aludido 49195 de esta empresa que hizo la traducción del documento, que se llama la Berlitz Translation Service. En él leemos: los objetivos principales en grueso interés se encuentran ligeramente al oeste del meridiano secreto y están apenas centrados alrededor del objetivo A y sus partes asistentes, que están localizadas en la vecindad inmediata de las coordenadas tales y tales. Está claramente escrito que los objetivos principales están localizados en la vecindad inmediata de unas coordenadas determinadas. Por tanto, creer que una serie de objetivos van a estar en un solo punto es como imaginarlos unos sobre otros, ¿no? Como si se tratara de un solo arrume de objetivos. Por favor. Bueno, dejemos ahí y pasemos a ver los polígonos que autorizó el gobierno Santos en 2015 a sus aliados en esta intentona contra los intereses de los colombianos. Inicialmente se autorizó en mayo de 2015 un polígono de 256 kilómetros cuadrados donde no encontraron nada. Y luego, en octubre de 2015, otro de 1.511 kilómetros cuadrados, donde el 26 de noviembre de 2015 redescubrieron finalmente el Galeón San José. Aunque aquí hay que agregar que la DIMAR y el Ministerio de Cultura ayudaron y mucho para que lo encontraran, pues entregaron nada más y nada menos que las coordenadas del año 1982. Este hecho está denunciado con pruebas irrefutables ante los organismos de control de Colombia desde febrero de 2019, sin resultados a la fecha. En este otro polígono podemos ver claramente en amarillo el polígono de Cícer Chamada del año 82 y en rojo los polígonos autorizados por el gobierno Santos en 2015, los cuales se aprecia claramente que se sobreponen en parte al polígono y precisamente en la zona en que fueron denunciados los objetivos principales. El gobierno Santos jamás ha debido entregar en exploración parte del polígono de 1982, pues sobre el mismo hay un litigio que aún no termina. Claro que como el tema era secreto, de esto no nos teníamos que enterar los colombianos, sino cuando ya el daño estuviera hecho, para seguramente después salir a decir que eso fue a sus espaldas, que ese tal polígono de Cícer no quedaba ahí, y que al final salga don Pueblo de Colombia a pagar los platos rotos, o como quien dice, nos quieren seguir viendo la cara de tontos. Pero gracias al valor, entereza y vocación real de servicio a este país, de un selecto personal de la Procuraduría Delegada para la Vigilancia Preventiva de la Función Pública, de la Procuraduría General de la Nación y del abogado César Duarte, quien instauró la acción popular, la trama se le vino abajo, aunque el mayor precio lo va pagando el doctor Leandro Ramos, quien entonces era el director de esa delegada, a quien inicialmente apartaron del puesto y lo pusieron donde no incomodara, para después de un tiempo prudente despedirlo. Infamia infinita. Finalmente tenemos la imagen 3, donde podemos ver un área verde, que es el área que jamás se ha debido entregar en exploración a un tercero, sin antes resolver el litigio que existe sobre ese sitio con los señores de Cícer Chamada, y donde todo parece indicar fue donde en 2015 se hizo el aberrante redescubrimiento del Galeón San José, el cual señalamos en el área verde con un punto rojo. Si los dos hallazgos coinciden en la misma zona que hemos demarcado en verde, que la inseguridad jurídica se eleva a un 95%, pues el hallazgo de Cícer Chamada quedar en esa zona verde y el hallazgo de 2015 haberse realizado en esa misma zona sobreponiéndose al polígono de Cícer Chamada es lo que eleva la inseguridad jurídica al 95%, y es la principal preocupación que ha tenido esta veeduría y este movimiento ciudadano por hacer entender al gobierno que esto está muy mal y que puede traer consecuencias nefastas contra el patrimonio público de los colombianos. Máxime, si tenemos presente lo que dice nuestra legislación en el artículo 20 del decreto 1698 de 2014, decreto reglamentario de la ley 1675 de 2013, que habla sobre la exclusividad del polígono. El Ministerio de Cultura se abstendrá de suscribir contratos de exploración en los polígonos ya asignados durante el tiempo en que exista otro contrato. Si el gobierno Santos no hubiese considerado que el tema de la exclusividad del polígono fuera algo muy importante, no se hubiera tomado la molestia de levantar el embargo que estuvo pesando sobre esos bienes en esa zona por 23 largos años, desde el 12 de octubre de 1994, que se dio el primer fallo a favor de Caesars Armada, hasta el 31 de octubre de 2017, que fue cuando el gobierno Santos logró, de una manera absolutamente exótica, que se levantara dicho embargo, para, ahí sí, poder contratar con sus amigos exploradores que habían redescubierto el galeón San José en noviembre de 2015, sin el riesgo que le fueran a embargar las riquezas que sacaran. Este asunto de levantar el embargo para vulnerar los derechos de Caesars Armada es algo literalmente aterrador. Pero gracias a los retrasos que causó al gobierno Santos la acción popular, la empresa Caesars Armada logró restaurar el embargo el 29 de marzo de 2019. En el embargo que se dictó el 12 de octubre de 1994, el cual fue ratificado en todas las instancias, se confirma lo dicho con respecto al asunto de la famosa vecindad. Abro comillas, no puede existir indeterminación o confusión sobre el objeto de la medida cautelar, que es obviamente el mismo objeto del proceso. Recae sobre los bienes que se encuentren en el sitio indicado en las coordenadas señaladas o en sus vecindades, de acuerdo a la redacción de la denuncia en la parte que corresponde al folio 13 del reporte sobre exploración submarina. Cierro comillas. Y este reporte no es otro que el mismo que ya vimos de la Berlitz Translation Service. Por tanto, es oportuno indicar que en esa exótica aberración jurídica de levantar el embargo, participaron decididamente el Ministerio de Cultura, la Procuraduría General de la Nación y la Agencia Nacional para la Defensa Jurídica del Estado. Además, en todo este enredo, el gobierno debe también tener presente el inciso del literal B del artículo 191 del Decreto Ley 2324 de 1984, el cual dice, abro comillas, si de hecho hubiere varios denunciantes respecto de una misma zona marina, se preferirá aquel cuya resolución de reconocimiento tenga la fecha más antigua. Cierro comillas. Con esta vergonzante maniobra, nuestros dirigentes nos tienen en este momento a un paso de comprometer el patrimonio público de los colombianos en miles de millones, pero no de pesos colombianos, miles de millones de dólares. Acanallada miserable. Esta maraña la venimos desenredando parte por parte, como lo pueden ver en este canal de YouTube, en esta serie de conferencias. Y hoy daremos un nuevo paso en esa dirección con esta 11ª conferencia que se denomina la versión de Caesars Armada, donde tendremos la oportunidad de escuchar a los propios protagonistas y conocer en detalle cómo fue que realmente ocurrieron las cosas, qué fue lo que encontraron, ver las imágenes del hallazgo y todas las circunstancias que han tenido que padecer ante lo que evidentemente es una política para intentar burlarlos. Aprovecho para adelantarles que en nuestra próxima conferencia vamos a tener la versión también de al menos uno de los oficiales de la Armada Nacional que acompañó esas exploraciones de Caesars Armada en los años 80 para conocer las dos versiones de los hechos y ahí sí bien informados, podamos hacernos a nuestra propia opinión. Bienvenidos.
Hello, my name is Mark Wren. My wife Kathleen and I will be your hosts and the interviewers for today's presentation. Today, you will find out how Sea Search Armada found the galleon San Jose in 1981. You will hear from 4 men that were on the expedition that found the San Jose in 1981. Today's presentation will begin with Mr. Jack Harbiston, who is the Managing Director of Sea Search Armada.
My name is Jack Harbiston. I'm the Managing Director of Sea Search Armada, a position I've held since 1988, when I was voted into that position by a majority of the investors in Sea Search Armada. I myself am an investor both in 1981 and 1982. And since 1988, I have done my best to represent Sea Search Armada and its dispute with the government of Colombia. I appreciate the invitation from Francisco Munoz to allow Sea Search Armada to at last give its side of the story to the Colombian people. We have not received equal press time at the government of Colombia. So for many of you people who are watching this, you'll be hearing our side for the first time and hearing it unfiltered through our eyes, and you'll have a much better idea of the facts of the matter, not just what propaganda or what somebody else said, but what factually is done. And most of the time, that will be backed up by documents that are readily available in the government archives and can be verified. Since 1980 to the present time, we have SSA, Sea Search Armada, has done its level best to cooperate in good faith with the government of Colombia. We have at all times operated strictly within the law and within regulation. And of course, we have acted in good faith. You'll be able to see, I think, in the course of this presentation that has not been the case for the government of Colombia. The other 4 members of this crew you will be hearing from as the broadcast progresses. And there were 2 crews actually in Cartagena. The first crew was Glacamora in 1980 and 81, and the second crew then came in with the deep diving submarine Auguste Piccard, and they had completely different sets of equipment. You'll be hearing more about that and detail regarding the equipment we use and the procedures we use from the people who actually operated the equipment and participated in the procedures. You'll get to see some of the equipment we use, and you will notice that it's very dated by today's standards. The technology so far beyond what we had to work with that it's almost embarrassing. But the easiest way to measure that is to take a look at the technology of 1980 and 1981. And that was just the very beginning of the computer age, where the best equipment you could get would be a desktop with a floppy drive and 8 bits. Today, of course, is so far beyond that is unreal. And that new technology is what enabled the AUV that the government of Colombia used. we have for you to see pictures of the San Jose and associated debris field. The venture was begun in 1979 under a company or a group of investors calling themselves Glaucomora, and they financed 2 trips to the San Jose in 1980 and 1981. They reorganized in 1981, late 1981, as Sea Search Armada. We have 2 fellows who were on the expeditions in 1980 and 1981, first as a surface survey group, which they will tell you about, and then later as a group that used the deep diving submersible research platform named Auguste Piccard. Okay, and so then now we go to Mike Donovan, and following him, you will hear the testimony of Roy Doty.
We're videoing. What do we got here? Oh my Lord. Does that look new, John? It sure does. Yeah, it does. What's that in the heart? Good helmet. That's not wood. No.
Hello, my name is Mike Donovan, and I was with the research project from 1980 to 1982 when Sea Search Armada was there. And that was when we found the San Jose. And I've been asked by Sea Search Armada to describe the experiences during this expedition some 40 years ago. On the target, we were experiencing some low battery cell alarms, flooding alarms. I was up in the forward hemisphere, I guess they call it, and I saw out, and there was definitely a ship there that had kind of collapsed down on itself.
Oh.
And then we had to get out of there because we were getting alarms on the battery, and then we had water had penetrated the hull. Mr. Robert Smith, Bob, as we called him, put together a group of former U.S. Navy trained operators to conduct a close-up investigation of the debris field. The debris field was found from the surface by a towed thing called a side scan sonar, and that was when the Morning Watch was down there.
Goes the fish over the side.
And they did the survey. The results of that side scan survey was turned over to people who analyzed it and picked up the top 23 targets. Went down and we used a surface-controlled, remote-controlled Trek. It was basically an underwater eyeball. And we did that with a process we called live boating. We had it over the side, and we used the surface vessel to go on tracks, which was courses that had been set up by me to survey the targets. And during that, we found that we had a couple targets down there, and that's when we found the San Jose. The side scan sonar produced a readout from the morning watch. This is the results of the side scan sonar. The people went out and they picked up the top targets. We went back with the Trek and looked at the targets. The side scan sonar gave us no visual. It just gave us a readout.
That's the picture of the bottom side scan showing either side of the towfish.
So this was a three-step process. You had a side scan sonar from the surface, then you had a remote vehicle from the surface, and then you had a submarine. Is that correct?
That is correct, and it's in that order. Okay, that's the Trek. It's sitting on the table, strapped down. They're doing a pre-dive check, running the thruster motors, doing the pan and tilt on the movie camera. You can see they're hooking a crane up, the cable on the crane, and they'll lift it off the table and swing it over the side. Then they'll release the hook on the crane, and the Trek will then be free to submerge.
All right, we'll let it run.
There they go. There's liftoff. And you see Bill Sutter back there directing the crane. The Hertz granite crane, by the way. Okay. And it's going over the side now. And they have the yellow, that's the umbilical. Pretty soon they're going to release the hook. Getting ready now, what they'll do is they'll pull and release the pelican hook. Trek will then be free to submerge and roam the ocean. There it goes. Now they're feeding the cable over the side. Okay, there's the yellow cable on there. That's the cable. It's 6,000 feet of cable on that reel. Now we're looking at video received from the Trek on the bottom.
Hello, I am Roy Doty, and I was a member of Sea Search Armada's Columbia expedition from 1980 to 1982, which located the San Jose and an associated debris field. My job was specifically to operate a Klein side-scan sonar, a Straza CTFM sonar, and an ISE limited ROV known as a Trek. I also represented the group as their on-site archaeologist. I was trained by retired U.S. naval operators on sonar operation and ROV operation, and I'm a graduate in archaeology from the University of New Mexico in Albuquerque, New Mexico. Our surveys were a three-part project to locate the cultural resources of the San Jose. Phase one was to utilize a side-scan sonar to identify potential targets. Phase two was to deploy the ROV, remote operational vehicle, Trek, tethered remote electronic camera, to further define targets. And third, the research submarine Auguste Piccard was brought in to further define targets. During the surveys, 23 potential targets were located, and out of the 23, 6 were defined as very possible potential targets of the San Jose. During our surveys, we located numerous wood piles and cannon. Behind me in the video, you can see a cannon that we found on one of our surveys. And what I'm going to do is I'll back record this and show you some of the wood piles so you're familiar with what I'm talking about. In this section of the video, the Trek is securing a wood sample. And our wood samples were extracted from the sites in a controlled manner. They were brought to the surface. I preserved them and they were sent off for analysis. I can say from one wood pile, it was identified as European, and the timeline was late 1600s. And by finding this one specific wood pile and having various samples analyzed, it put us in the timeline, the chronology of the San Jose. Here is a great example of one of the wood piles. You can see a lot of the wood is angular. It's like planks, and we found 20 to 30 of these wood piles in one specific area, which Jack Haskins defined as a debris field of the San Jose. And by that, it's the debris that occurred during the battle between Wagner and the San Jose. Here we're extracting a sample that was brought to the surface. This specific one was analyzed. Here's the cannon that we found. You can see at the end of the cannon the muzzle. And after this, we went to another wood pile and we found another cannon. So this, in association with the wood piles, we're very, very positive that we're on the site of the San Jose. And given the size of this debris field, it's a massive debris field. I mean, you have jetsam and flotsam, and it's all incorporated with the Battle of the San Jose. During my time with the project, I worked on the Marine Vehicle State Progress, the Marine Vehicle State Wave, and the research submarine, the Auguste Piccard. This is a shot we caught at the Trek Shack. The video recorder's on top with the joysticks, the two videos. The operator controlled the left and right and forward and aft movements of the Trek. And the other is the sonar, the Straza CTFM. We use that as our guiding light for hard targets. You could always tell when you had a hard target, a metallic target, by the return signal coming into the Straza.
And you did some of this operation?
Yeah, I operated the Trek and the sonar as well, and I was trained by the man in the hat. And here's the video. I think we're coming up eventually on a wood pile. I think we're trying to stabilize the Trek right now to get control. Because normally when we had the cable at the bitter end, we would always pull the Trek back, mimicking the wave actions on the surface. So it was always a challenge. We had 6,000 feet of cable and we were always at 6,000 feet. Literally, we bounced it along the bottom numerous times. And very hard to control. I believe there's a target coming up.
Here's the next one, Bill.
and I thank you.
You will now hear from the men who were on the submarine, the men who saw the San Jose with their own eyes through the portholes of the submarine.
We hope this has been a successful dive, and we'll wait till we get back there to analyze the data.
Hello, my name is John Swan, Captain John Swan. I'm certified in the UK as a Master Mariner foreign going, which essentially means a captain with unlimited command. I've enjoyed a professional career at sea and in the marine industry for some 60 years. During the period 1981-82, I worked for Sea Search Armada as the commander of the research and survey submarine Auguste Piccard, engaged in a search for the wreck of a sunken galleon off the Atlantic coast of Colombia, South America.
At the con on the Auguste Piccard is John Swan, the master. Doing a superb job.
You may have heard stories and false claims recently made by a certain group in Colombia and abroad in association with the search for the San Jose and its treasures. These claims would have you believe that we, Sea Search Armada, were nothing more than a group of disorganized, opportunistic and mercenary treasure hunters. I should hope, after listening to our story during this presentation, that you will come to understand that nothing could be further from the truth. Here is our story, told firsthand by the people who were there, following which you will, I hope, come to your own more informed conclusions. Sea Search Armada was in fact working under an agreement with the government of Colombia to search for, locate and identify the wreck of the galleon San Jose. The San Jose unfortunately suffered a massive explosion and sank during a battle with a small English expeditionary naval fleet in 1708 off Cartagena on the Caribbean coast of Colombia, South America. The San Jose, besides carrying an immense amount of pillaged artifacts and gold, was also carrying a crew and passengers of more than 600 people on voyage back to Spain. Sadly, there were only a few survivors who were rescued by the Royal Navy ship HMS Expedition. The supportable facts show that far from being opportunistic treasure hunters, Sea Search Armada was working under a legal, mutually binding agreement with and for the then acting government of Colombia. The agreement required Sea Search Armada to search for, locate and identify the wreck of the galleon San Jose. On locating the wreck, the agreement required Sea Search Armada to provide the coordinates to the Colombian government. The search and location was carried out successfully, and Sea Search Armada complied with every requirement set forth by the agreement. However, shortly following a meeting in Bogota in which Sea Search Armada submitted the coordinates as required, the government reneged on the agreement and attempted to change the conditions therein. I know because I was present at that meeting. As a consequence of this meeting, events took a drastic and unfortunate turn. In May 1982, shortly following the meeting with the Government of Colombia, after surfacing from ongoing operations, the Auguste Piccard was intercepted, and myself, my crew, and my submarine were arrested by Colombia's Department of Security, DAS, without charges or explanation. Fortunately, the Colombian Navy in Cartagena came to our rescue, and we were held under house arrest at the Navy base in Cartagena until we were released in early June 1982. Our expedition, the search for the San Jose, was a most challenging one, with exceptional physical and financial risks, which consequently demanded a variety of dedicated and experienced specialists. As the qualified commander of the submarine, I personally can vouch for the professionalism of the Sea Search Armada team. All of the personnel were either qualified professionals, experienced mariners, engineers, or technicians. The senior oceanographer and operations manager, Mr. Helmut Lanziner, was a vastly experienced subsea and positioning technician. His company, Offshore Systems Limited, was extensively employed by the offshore oil and gas industry, developing energy projects in the Canadian Arctic. Mr. Lanziner was later awarded the Order of Canada for his international development work in the invention of electronic charts, which are now used every day in many forms in virtually every part of the world. In further dispelling the misinformation spread by certain parties, you should be aware that Sea Search Armada worked closely with the authorities and Government of Colombia, including, as you may have realized, the Colombian Navy, and to whom we reported regularly on the progress of the search. In addition, on every dive, we took on board the Auguste Piccard one or sometimes two submarine officers of the Colombian Navy submarine fleet. These gentlemen had the freedom of our submarine and were allowed to monitor every aspect of our search operations in order for them to report to their senior officers and government representatives. In addition, I provided all the officers in question who shared our search with signed and stamped certificates confirming their participation in our exceptionally deep operational dives. Typically, these dives are well beyond the norm for conventional naval submarines. On the legal side of things, I should also advise that the Auguste Piccard had been entered and cleared into Colombia, and we had engaged a registered and licensed ship's agent, Captain Cesar Rojas Franco, of the shipping agency Issacal in Cartagena, to represent us. We also employed a number of local Colombians to assist us in our daily work and had established residential headquarters in Cartagena. At all times, we complied with the laws of Colombia, and I insisted that all my officers and crew conducted themselves accordingly. Apart from the expertise of the Sea Search Armada team, the most important piece of equipment in the legal search for the San Jose was the submarine RSS Auguste Piccard. Let me tell you something about this incredible civilian submarine. The Auguste Piccard was the largest civilian submarine in the world, and, as a Messerscaf, was certified by the American Bureau of Shipping, ABS, to dive and operate up to a depth of 670 meters. Her design crush depth was 1,500 meters. She was built in Switzerland in 1964 for the Swiss World's Fair to a design by Jacques Piccard, the son of the renowned Dr. Auguste Piccard, and consequently named after his father. Following the World's Fair, during which she took some 35,000 tourists to the bottom of Lake Geneva, the submarine was sold by the Swiss government and purchased by a private company, Horten Maritime Explorations Limited, to be extensively modified for research and survey purposes in Vancouver, BC, Canada. Many years later, she was chartered by Sea Search Armada to provide an ideal and capable working platform for the search for the San Jose. The Auguste Piccard, official call sign Charlie Zulu 3800, was a civilian submarine, and while well advanced in her operating capabilities for that era, did not, of course, carry any form of armament. She was 28.5 meters in overall length, 6.0 meters in beam, with a surface draft of 3.66 meters. The pressure hull was constructed of a very special composite metal, Aldor 5568, some 3.5 centimeters thick, stiffened by 15 centimeter square section steel ring ribs in order to be able to operate safely at great depths. She had a submerged displacement of 178 tons and a design cruising range of approximately 1,500 kilometers. The Piccard was operated by a crew of 5, with the capacity to carry a further 5 observers and technicians. She was fitted with sleeping accommodations, a head, and a small galley. The remaining space was dedicated to the control room, electronic operations compartment, and the engine room. The forward hemispherical cap was reserved as a small observation area through 3 specially designed viewing ports. She could dive and remain submerged for some 12 to 14 hours and had a maximum surface and submerged speed of approximately 5 knots. In addition to an extensive list of 1970s state-of-the-art electronic survey and positioning equipment, which you will hear about, she was also designed to carry a small remote-operated vehicle. However, during this particular expedition, she was equipped with a sophisticated Trek ROV, which was fitted with underwater cameras, underwater lights, and an advanced manipulator.
We're looking at the Trek assembly now, and shortly they'll be hooking it up to that davit and lifting it into the water. Normally the Piccard would go to the bottom with the Trek on deck just as it is, and once it's down there, why they would release it and fly it off from the Auguste Piccard. This is the same Trek that we used last year. It's hopefully all fixed up and ready to go.
Using this ROV, we were able to collect a significant amount of recorded video of the target and the surrounding search area. A typical day of search operations commenced at 0500 hours, while moored alongside the surface support vessel. Our operational day started with a complete check of the previous evening's maintenance work carried out by a team of engineers during the previous night. The submarine would then be rigged for sea and, following breakfast, would let go and be towed by the support vessel out to sea and to the dive site. The dive site and search area was located some considerable distance off the coast in the proximity of Colombia's territorial limits, well west of the Rosario Islands. Immediately prior to arriving on the dive site, the submarine was rigged for dive, which essentially prepared the submarine in all respects for making its initial dive of the day, in order to continue with the pre-established search grid. With the crew at diving stations, and with all pre-diving checks completed satisfactorily, the diesel engines were stopped and isolated, and the battery-powered electric motor engaged. I would then take on additional ballast forward, deploy the forward diving planes, arm and open the main vents in order to flood the soft tanks, and dive the submarine to catch a trim at approximately 30 meters. At this depth, the main vents would be recycled while completing an underwater sub-to-surface UQC communications check and all-round situation check. Rigged for deep dive, and with all in order, we would continue the dive to take up the appropriate search position as required by the Search Operations Manager, Helmut Lanziner. A typical day's diving operation would last for 10 to 12 hours, at which point we would, after completing all the necessary procedures, surface and start the main diesels in order to return to our base close to San Martin in the Rosario. During one particular operational dive, very early in December 1981, after completing one search track and making a hard turn to starboard to pick up the next adjacent track, we observed and recorded a large target on the side scan. This target was much larger than any of the objects previously observed and recorded. To this date, we had observed, located and recorded numerous targets of interesting wood piles in the area and taken video records. This new target, the only large target in the general search area, provided a side scan shadow representing a shape with high and low extreme ends and of the approximate length of that of a galleon the size of the San Jose. The coordinates of this target were recorded and subsequently submitted to the Government of Colombia by the President of Sea Search Armada, Mr. Warren Stearns. Again, I was at this meeting in Bogota when the coordinates were submitted to the government. Many subsequent dives were made on this particular large target location, and on grounding the submarine gently on the seabed close to the location and taking on extra ballast, the ROV was deployed to investigate, inspect, and take detailed video of the target. Following one of these many investigations of the target, we found samples of fashioned timbers with what appeared to be man-made holes in one end. The timbers were found lodged in the open stern compartment of the Picard's propeller shaft. Later carbon dating of one of the samples in London, England, showed it to be of an age and maturity of timbers typically used in the building of ships in the era of the galleon San Jose. In conclusion, weighing all the collected evidence, both physical and recorded, there is absolutely no doubt in my mind that we, Sea Search Armada, had following an exhaustive and demanding search, while overcoming many life-threatening dangers and challenges, found the wreck, or a very large part thereof, of the lost galleon San Jose. Thank you for listening.